Cryptids are seemingly some of your guys' favorite stories. We're getting pretty far into this series now, closing in on episode 15. Maybe we'll have to do something special for that. In today's video, my good friend Southern Cannibal is joining me to share some of your creepy stories that you have sent in. If you have a story that you'd like to hear on a future video, be sure to send it in to the website or the email that you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your stories. Now, let's get in to these stories. To start off, I'm a young man, and I have been a Christian for many years now, and would consider myself very strong in the faith. I've also seen many things that I can only hope that not many other people ever will. Now, my tales are not exactly a single story, but yet a compilation of a few experiences that are strongly connected. From a very young age, I had been followed or rather stalked by a creature that I could not identify until years after my first experience. One of the earliest memories that I have is of me laying on the top bunk of my bunk bed with my younger sister under me. My older sister was in the room adjacent from me, and my parents were in the room at the end of the hall. I remember awakening in bed and glancing around to see what had awakened me. I looked at the glowing blue numbers on my alarm clock, 4:25 a.m. My eyes then shifted to the dark hallway, lit only by a small night light, emitting a faint orange light. Then, I realized what had awakened me, as I could hear a deep voice coming from the hall. It began to speak in tongues. I, to this day, cannot understand what it was saying. I felt as if the voice were speaking to me, as if it only wanted me to awake to hear its gravelly lullaby. I slid down the ladder and checked on my sisters. Both were still asleep. Thinking it could have been my dad or the TV, I snuck into my parents' room. Both were in deep sleep, and the TV was black and turned off. Still curious, I went downstairs to see if that TV was left on as well. To my avail, it wasn't. And so, the child I was, terrified of the unknown in the dark, I bolted up the stairs. As I lay in my bed, I could still hear the deep, gravelly voice in the hall. Years later, it was the summer and I was 10. My family moved, and though I still had the bunk bed, I had my own room with a huge window. At the time, I had blinds over the window, which still let tons of light in, but regardless, I had them. Because it was the summer, I had been sleeping in, probably about 11. I remember laying on the top bunk with the ladder and the window both right above my head. I remember awakening with a jolt and instantly sitting up and turning right all in one motion, only to see a completely black silhouette of a man with large white eyes climbing the ladder of my bed. In the same second that I did this, I awoke for real, in the same exact thing, seeing the same exact figure, all in the same second. Like mentioned, this entire thing happened in 1 second, and I have come to the realization that the first jolt was a dream, and the second was actually me waking up. I yet again repeated, but without ever laying back down. Of course, the instant I blink, the shadow is gone. I have considered this being sleep paralysis, except I was far from being paralyzed. Now for the part where I connect these two stories and tell a new one all at once. This happened the summer I was 12, and this summer was packed full of these encounters, so I'll only tell the most dramatic. It was night, and I was up later than anyone else in my family due to the fact that there was no school for months. It was pretty late, and after I finally decided to sleep, I laid in my bed, no longer the bunk bed, and see a figure in the corner. It was the same exact figure I saw just 2 years earlier, and yet again, He just stared for a while before he began to speak in that same deep, gravelly voice that I heard so many years before. Yet again, he spoke in a language unknown to man. But, to compare it to something, it sounds really similar to the language the orcs in the Lord of the Rings speak. He just stops there, immersed in shadow, and spoke to me. I sat in horror for maybe 5 minutes, maybe an hour, I don't know. To be honest, it felt like forever. After he was done, he went silent and laid back into the shadows until he was devoured by them. I lay there still for hours before exhaustion got the best of me. It was about this time in my life that when I tried to classify this creature into some category of animal, I came up empty-handed. It was then that I felt enough connections between this creature and the demons described in the Bible to classify it as maybe possibly being one. After I realized that it was a demon that had been plaguing my nights, I began to look for them in the Bible and read as much of them as I could. I found most of my stuff in New Testament and a little in the Old Testament. I learned how to scare them off and how to get them to leave. The skill became essential as time went on, and as I took my life back, I could see that they were getting more and more brave as the years went on. One night, I was practicing my double bass for orchestra in our office. After a while, I saw a small, what I could only say demon, sitting by the cabinet. It was only about 1 to 2 feet tall, stood there and growled at me. He began to let out what I could only describe as like a scream or a whine or a wail all mixed together. It tried to lash out and strike at me. After about a minute of me watching this, I finally yelled, "In the name of Lord Jesus Christ, be gone!" And with that, it shrieked and ran away. That was my first time getting rid of what I can only describe as a demon, and I owe it to finding out how to do it in the Bible. My final encounter that I feel comfortable sharing was also in the same summer. Once again, I was in my bed near the end of summer, and after I lay down, I once more see the demon standing in the same corner as last time. Also, just like last time, he stood for about a minute before speaking. However, after about a minute of this, he rose his left arm and pointed out my open window. I looked out, and it looked like I could see more shadows of somewhat human-looking creatures. Except these ones were taller, maybe 8 to 10 feet tall, muscular, and rotten-looking. It was really creepy, and to this day I don't really think I can give you a solid description. I'm still encountering these things every once in a while. I have also come to the realization that they are constantly surrounding us, yet they only occasionally unveil themselves for our eyes. I wish you all a good day and hope that you never encounter what I have.
Growing up, I was always told to be careful outside and never go out alone during the day or night in the woods. And for most of my childhood, I was good at it, but my family did have a few bumps in the night that seemed to scare my father. And around the time I turned 14, my father had enough and we packed up and moved. But he could never sell it since it was his family's home that his grandfather built after he came over from Germany right before the turn of the century. Anyway, the property will come into play for the other 2 stories, but my first one isn't anywhere near my place. One snowy night when I was a senior in high school, my friend and I decided to go out for a midnight drive down a back road that had a railroad track to one side and woods on the other. As we approach a small bridge type thing for a small creek, we see the car that is coming towards us slam on its gas and peels out of there. Me and my friend didn't really think much of it since we were about 100 yards away, but as we pull up, this big blackish gray thing comes running out into the middle of the road and jumps into the creek bed that was about 6 feet off the ground. But before it did that, it gave us this look with bright orangish yellow eyes, and as it goes into the bed, me and my friend both look at each other and scream at the top of our lungs, and then he steps on the gas to get out of there. The next day after school, we went straight over the bridge that this thing had jumped into. We found some tracks, but they all looked like something was heavy and fast moved through the area. We left not knowing what it was. My second encounter happened when I was 20 and out deer hunting on the farthest part of my property. I was hunting by myself, which I liked to do at the time, especially being home from college. I just really liked the peace and quiet. Anyways, at the time I was armed with my rifle and I was a pretty good shot at about 100 yards with it. Anyway, I had been sitting in my tree stand where I started to hear footsteps running along sounding like a big buck running. So I got my gun ready for this big buck to come running out, but instead it was this big brown dog. Then I realized it wasn't a dog at all, and by the time the thing stopped and looked at me, it started to snarl its teeth at me. I think I said something like, "What the hell?" and pointed my gun at his head and fired. The creature fell down, and for a few moments I thought it was dead. So I made the stupidest decision in my life to walk up on this thing and look at it. As I walked up onto it, it looked like it had fell forward instead of backwards, like I had seen it do when I had shot it. And as I get closer to it, I realize the thing isn't dead. As I walk up closer to it, it starts to stand up, and that's when I realized the thing had to be at least 6.5 feet tall. What felt like forever lasted for a few seconds, and that's when I pulled my .44 Magnum revolver from my hip. I think I shot 4 rounds into its chest. The thing then looked down at its chest and then back at me, then jumped back onto all fours and ran into the thick brush. This is when I dropped my rifle and ran back to my truck. After this incident, I left and never came back due to the fact of what I saw, but that all changed when I got married. My third encounter happened 7 years after my last encounter. Shortly after I got married, me and my wife had decided to buy some horses. Since both of us have grown up with them and that I would be becoming a vet, it just seemed right to us to have some large animals on the property. About a year after we moved onto the property, we had problems with our horses and other livestock. At first, we thought it was just a pack of coyotes, but I couldn't ever find any coyotes on my game cams. So I decided to hunt them, but had no success with that either. So I ruled out that coyotes are the problem. Shortly after that, everything started to calm down with the animals. On the day of my encounter, I had decided to take out a young mare out to stretch her legs for a competition my wife was going to be competing in that weekend. I had also brought my 110-pound Rottweiler along with an old double-barrel shotgun due to the fact of what I saw when I was out hunting when I was 20 years old. About a mile into the woods, my horse started to get spooked. So I got off of her trying to calm her down when I noticed my dogs are growling and looking in the same direction as she is. So I turned around and I see this big dog-looking human thing. I tell my dogs to go home and they slowly back up and take back off into the direction of the house. And that's when my horse starts getting antsier. As I hop back on my horse, I look back to the animal and I see it charging us. I had kicked my horse as hard as I can to get it going. Not looking back, I rode all the way back to the barn thinking this thing was hot on our trail. But when I break the tree line 50 yards from my barn, I realized nothing was following us, so I put my horse back up in the barn after I calmed her down. That is when I began to notice 3 deep cuts into the backside of my horse inches away from where I was sitting. I was terrified. I called the sheriff to come take a look at my horse and my property to find out what did this. 2 cops came to my house that night. 1 sheriff and 1 local cop. The local cop said it looked like knife wounds and had asked me if I cut my horse. I said no, this was an animal that did this. He didn't believe me and then left. The sheriff, on the other hand, went out there to look for himself and came back to me 15 minutes later. He said that he recommends me to be alerted on my property and armed at all times. That or move somewhere else. I think he saw this animal, but I haven't had any problems with this lately. But it's been 4 years since all of this happened and it feels like the time is near. But I really hope it's not.
I've lived my whole life, almost 30 years, in Arkansas. Being raised a son of the South, it should go without saying that I spent a considerable amount of time in our state's vast woodlands, hunting, camping, etc. So I never had any fear of the unknown. depths of the forest or whatever woodland creatures resided out there until about 4 years ago. When I was a child, my parents moved us from a small town of Poyen out to a small town about 40 miles south of Little Rock. Both of my parents worked full-time jobs in order to pay off our new house and a significant swath of land bordering my grandfather's land. So, through much of my early childhood and early school, later on, I would go on and spend much of my time with my grandpa while my parents got home. He was a sweet old man, kind of an old hippie. About once a week, he would ask me to go on a walk with him through the forest, and in a time before I had cable or Xbox, I would gladly agree. Anything to get me out of the house and my own bedroom. Every walk was the same. About a half-mile trip down a good work path, past a large pit at the end of a tree, and then turning in at a trash line. We would go through some sandy marshes that were dry almost year-round, and eventually to a large oak tree and a hollowed knot growing on it about chest-high. When we got there, he would reach into his jacket pocket and pull out 3 or 4 eggs he would leave on the hollow. The first time I asked him why, he told me that before was a church on every corner, people used to live and die and pray in the forest. That the forest was more than just trees and squirrels, that it looked after people. All of this sounded like religious nonsense. I had already had several head-butting arguments with my parents at this point over religion. Them being devout Baptists, and I putting my faith more in a good Remington than some man in the clouds, I honestly never paid it much mind after that. I still accompanied him on his walks though, and just thought of him as some kooky old man who dropped too much acid in the 70s. Until about 4 years ago when he died. He left me his house and his land, and I moved in right quick, eager to make it out of that shitty little apartment I had ended up in some 45 miles away. My parents had split up and both moved to different places by then, so it was comforting on some level to go back to a place where I spent so much of my early life. In about a week's time after moving in, I had a good bit of trash to burn. Some of my stuff, but mostly my grandpa's old junk he never got around to tossing out. It was mid-autumn by this point, but still way too hot during the day to have a fire, so I waited till about dusk, grabbed the last few bags of trash and some freezer-burned food, and made my way to the pit. I had the fire blazing after a couple of minutes. The last slivers of sunlight had dropped below the forest, making the only light the tall flickering flames dancing off around the trees. I sat down on an old stump and lit a cigarette as I watched the flames. I was so deeply enthralled in the orange and red dance, I had forgotten to throw the last load of trash in the pit. So, I stood and kicked the 2 bags into the flame and began unwrapping all the freezer-burned ground beef, peas, and steaks, throwing their contents into the tree line and the plastic into the flames. It wasn't until I threw the last steak, a big frosty T-bone, besides a corpse of smooth, white bark birch trees that something happened. I heard something. Something low and rumbling. Not quite a growl, but far from being a comforting sound. Then, one of the branches of one of the smaller birches began to bend, almost like it was falling in slow motion. Then, extended out, and I saw from the firelight with a horror that I had previously thought were long little branches were gnarled, impossibly long fingers ending in savage points. They sunk into the cold meat, and something half stepped out of the cover of the trees. It was hunched down and thin, but I could tell it would be a good foot over my head should it decide to stand. It looked at me the whole time, and slowly dragged the meat over to itself. Its eyes reflected no light, and I couldn't make out any facial characteristics except a mouth too wide for its head, filled with canines. It brought the steak to its mouth, and with a sickening crunch ripped a piece off. I didn't see much after that. I guess I had been standing, and slowly backing away because the next clear thought I had was sprinting back to the house where I bolted the door and loaded my shotgun. I sat up all night, my head swimming with questions. Grandpa had never said anything about a creature living in the woods. But come morning, I was convinced that's why he left those eggs out every week. A few days later, when I had the nerve to step back into the forest, I went in with a pocket full of eggs and placed them in the hollow, just like he used to. I haven't seen or heard anything like that. I haven't seen or heard anything like what happened that night in 4 years. Yet once a week every week, I make a trip into the forest and leave my offering. Yet to this day, I have not once stepped anywhere near the tree line after dark. To begin with, I live in Jackson, Missouri, out in the middle of nowhere. This story, I swear, is true, and it is the most scared I have ever been in my entire life. Okay, so this happened in 2014, and I would have been 14 at the time, and it was in the middle of summer, and it was about probably 11 o'clock at night. My mom came into the living room and asked if I wanted to ride with her out to the water district to pay our water bill. I love night drives, so of course I told her I'd go. We headed out to the water tower, and it was pitch black except for the shining of the moon on the road. My mom, my sister, and I were talking and having fun until we got to the water tower. I'm a big baby when it comes to the dark. I'm terrified of the dark, especially where I live. We arrived at the water tower, and I opened the door and I heard weird sounds coming from the water tower. I told my mom, but she thought I was just kidding or getting too scared. I stepped out of the truck and walked to the door and slid the envelope into the door. I ran back to the truck as fast as I could and slammed the door. My mom laughed at me and she backed out of the driveway of the water district. We were turning onto the highway and all of a sudden, a huge creature flew out in front of our truck. This thing was like 8 feet tall and had a wingspan of 10 feet. It was a gray color and had the body of a man. It looked like it flew down from the water tower. It definitely came down from a height. It flew slow and close to the ground. It seemed like time slowed down and the world stopped for a couple of minutes while we stared at this creature. My mom and I screamed and my mom floored it out of there. She had me looking behind us to make sure it wasn't following us home. We were in shock, and my sister didn't see it because she was on her phone, but she heard us screaming. We finally made it home and I ran inside. I didn't sleep that night, and I was crying really hard. I'm still terrified of the water tower, and I will never go back out there at night. I found out that a conservation area is out there, and it's probably where the creature lives. About a year ago, an episode of Monsters and Mysteries in America came on, and it was about flying humanoids. I automatically started crying again, and I ran to tell my mom about it. The sighting was in the Ozarks in Missouri, and for those who don't know, the Ozarks are about 4 hours away from where I live. The men in the show described exactly what we saw. The gray color of the man, the height of the creature and the wingspan, the flying in front of the car, and coming from a height. Not many people believe us, but that's fine. I know what I saw, and I don't need anybody else to tell me that. When I was a kid, I was already a very lonely one. I had almost no friends and was only a child for the first decade of my life until my younger brothers were born. So to make up for the lack of human interaction in my life, I was known for having a fertile imagination. Wherever I went, wherever it was, all my family says that they remember me having more imaginary friends than any kid could imagine. They weren't just your common made-up goofy creatures or the princess still waiting for the prince, though. They were many mythological creatures, like fairies, dwarves, or sometimes small dragons. That may be one of the things that may come in handy later, as I'm not sure myself if what I saw was real or just the imagination of a kid who was so scared that they tried to make an excuse for something seemingly completely normal. I'm 15 as I'm writing this, though to tell this story we have to go back when I was around 8 or 9. I was living in Portugal back then, and I still am to this day, with the exception that now we live in the capital and not in the outskirts of a smaller city. But that's not important for this story right now. But what's important, however, is that when I was younger, my mother and I used to go with her friends on small trips south to a beach fairly known for its tourism, and we went there every summer without an exception until this happened. On this particular year, it was only me, my mother, and one of her friends, who dragged his nephew who was my age along. With names it'll be easier, though for privacy reasons I'll have to change them. Let's say that my mom's friend is Vitor, and the boy is Alfonso. As soon as we arrived to the small Maker's Shift parking lot, me and Alfonso immediately jumped out of the car, grabbing our beach toys and sprinting to the beach. Neither of the adults were worried, since they knew that we were smart kids and wouldn't go further than the place where the water met the sand. So they took their time, taking some of the crucial things from the car trunk, and eventually met up with us on the beach itself. The day was overall fun and rather relaxed, at least until we decided to go into the water for the last time before heading to the cabin where we would be staying for the night. So, while my mom was taking sunbaths, me, Vitor, and Afonso went for one last swim. About 10 minutes passed normally, and we are playing tag in the water. I was hiding under the surface so it would be harder for them to spot me, when suddenly a pain in my right leg made me scream underwater. Before I knew it, I was being pushed to the depths of the lake, the pain only increasing as something seemed to dig into my flesh, my arms reaching just above the water to signal that I needed help while trying to swim away from this senseless grip. It's amazing how the human can be so strong when its life depends on it. After a while, my overall wimpy body gave up, and I was dragged further into the bottom. My eyes started to make everything darker and fuzzier. Last thing I remember would scare me for life. A gigantic, dragon-like creature in an ill shade of green and traumatizing glowing amber eyes was almost biting my leg off. I was in such a state of shock, I think I must have blacked out. It wasn't until later I'd wake up with the warmth of my cabin's room, my aching leg now bandaged up. I immediately screamed for my mom, who was just casually walking in after hearing me call out for her. First thing I remember asking was, "Did you get the monster?" "What monster?" my mom asked with a perplexed look on her face. "The monster that pushed me into the water," I overwhelmingly screeched, getting a scold from my mother for it, as her shouting is a very offensive term here. Blame the fact that Iberian languages make you seem like you're screaming at someone half of the time. "What are you talking about? There was no monster there. You just stepped too deep into the water." I don't know what exactly happened after, but I do remember a lot of arguing with my mother after trying to convince her that it was something beyond natural that had done this to me. One thing I'm sure of though, if I simply lost my foot in the water, how come that was able to have a tooth-like scar on my leg? That just doesn't make any sense, and I can't quite explain it. But I know what happened, and it doesn't matter what anyone else says. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed these stories, be sure to hit that like button, as it helps this video grow and reach more people. Much love and appreciation to my good friend, Southern Cannibal, for helping read story number 2. If you enjoyed his voice, be sure to check out his channel as he uploads tons of creepy videos all the time, similar to what I do here. If you have a story that you'd like to hear on a future video, be sure to send it in to the email or the website that you can find in the description down below. I would love to see your stories and share them with everyone else. Also, I have some brand new shirts out now on the merch store, so be sure to check them out. I think you guys will enjoy them. The shirt's designs are all based off stories and series that we cover here on the channel. Be sure to comment down below if you made it all the way to the end. I'd love to see how many of you make it from start to finish. See you guys soon with another creepy video.